20 years ago, when, we started on Anita's side, we got the book for the first 10 years.
Oh.
Yeah, we started doing embroidery designs. And why did we start? Well, what was available back then in the marketplace was, 4x4, little strawberries and monograms and super basic, little things that, people would buy a little machine and they would embroider like a name and a little baby bib and stuff like that. Things that we still do, but there's nothing else back then. The biggest size that anybody ever would stitch was like a 5x7. Even though the machines were getting bigger, there was really not a lot of design going on in that field. So, the company was started, and right away we started by doing bigger, more elaborate designs. Still what we continue to do to this day. But everything back then was made for direct embroidery. So that means you would take a shirt and hoop it and stitch on it, or like I said, a baby bib or a towel or something like that. It wasn't really like project-driven, stuff like that. So I always remember seeing people at these events, and I would teach all over the country, and I'd see these people make these quilts. And my mom wasn't a quilter, so I didn't really know like a lot, about it. And they go, basically, we take all these little pieces of fabric, and everybody loves this fabric. So we'd find, all right, this fabric that's in a bundle, and it would be these just, fat quarters is what they're called. That means they're, basically a quarter yard. And, we would take a perfectly good piece of fabric like this, and then they would cut it into little tiny pieces by hand. So you would take like a ruler, and quilters have all these tools, rotary cutters, rulers, little templates, and you would take a piece like this and you would cut it into all these little strips of fabric or triangles, or depending on the pattern you're making. If it was something like say like this little square here, you would cut each one of these pieces of fabric separately. Okay, measure them, you'd stack them up, and then you would take those pieces of fabric and you would take them to a sewing machine and stitch them together, and then you would press them open, and so on and so on and so on. Okay, so then you have your quilt top. That's how quilt is started. It's not how it's quilted, it's how it's like, this is where you get your like basis for the quilt. So then you wind up with all these little strips of fabric stitched together, and you have this big thing, and that's it. So then what do you have to do? Well then, here's the next step, is you would take your quilt top, and you would take this quilt batting, and this is like the puffy stuff. This is called warm and natural. There's a whole bunch of different kinds. And you would layer, your quilt top. Again, this is no embroidery. This is just sewing. And you would take your fabric, and put it on top of that you made, and you'd stitch that together. So if you wanted it to be like all puffy in there, you would do free motion stippling. So if you've never seen somebody do it, you can Google it. It's probably the hardest thing I've ever seen people do, because you're actually taking these pieces of fabric, and the sewing machine, you're controlling it with your foot, and then you're hand guiding the fabric to do all these little shapes like this. So just imagine hand tracing, or not hand like just not tracing, just hand guiding your machine to form this and do all these, what you see stitch out in these backgrounds. So 20 years ago, that's how people did it. It was the only way to make a quilt. Really hard. So I tried making one then, not successful. Total disaster. Like, you have to pay attention to every single thing you do. Every piece of fabric has to be perfectly cut. Perfect. You have to line it up perfectly. You have to stitch together perfectly. And then you have to free motion stitch it. And that's where it could all go literally right in the toilet. And then you're still not done. Then you have to bind the quilt. And you have to take this whole edge and then, make your bias, fabric, cut your fabric into strips, and then fold it under, stitch it together. Okay, then you're finally done. So how enjoyable is it at that point?
It's a labor of love.
It's a labor of love. That's what quilters did then. And you were severely limited by what you could do. The only way to get better at, so there was people that would just specialize in piecing your quilt. So if maybe you were good at cutting, you could send it somewhere for them to piece it together. You could send it somewhere else for someone to quilt it. and they would have these big giant machines. We used to have one here that have these big handles on it, and you put the whole quilt on it, and then you kind of like move this thing around, and that's what does this free motion quilting. Still done that way, but nobody had ever done embroidered quilts. This is what we do. So what we did with our whole quilting system, quilting 1, 2, 3, mix and match quilting, any of whatever, whether we're doing it on the studio side or Anita's side, we kind of make quilts and components of quilts every day. So how are they made now? Well, all of that programming is done by Jeff, myself, in the computer. So I'm doing the stippling, we're doing the applique placement. So you start by doing something like this, which would be monumentally hard or impossible to do the old way. So now we just stitch, the square in your hoop, put your batting, put your top fabric together, it'll do the stippling on it, and then you just trim around the block. And then you put your next fabric down, you don't have to measure it. No measuring. You don't need rulers to create it like an Anita Good Design quilt. I could just take my fabric like this big, throw it down, it'll stitch it, you fold it over, trim it. Next piece of fabric. So to create these really complicated blocks, even something that looks as simple as this, you don't have to measure any of this border fabric. You're just following the lines, just like when we're creating on the studio side, the horses, or Emily's making those with all these different fabrics. You follow the outline of where to put the fabric down, stitches it down, and trims it. It's, there's no like, I have to measure this fabric in advance and pre-cut it with a template. That's how it used to be done. So we came out with this mix and match style where basically you could create quilts that look like they were done by the most expert quilter in the world in your hoop with no measuring and none of that. It was, when I say revolutionary, nobody had ever done things this way. And then you could add your embroidery designs to it, things that were impossible before. So in a couple folds, you would create the stippling, create the border. 10 minutes, you have this background block instead of hours. And then you could add any design you want on top of it. So had that been done before we did it, it hadn't. Then you could do things again, like Anita's Playhouse here, with designs going between the blocks. When you see these up close, and hopefully you'll look at things a different way now, when you see all that stippling and free motion and things in the backgrounds, crazy quilt patterns that were made with scraps of fabric. All of these things are done now in your hoop without measuring. So for people that come here and start doing it, all right, is it like instant where you snap your fingers? No, you still have to put the fabric down and stitch it, and you still have to fold it. But if you had ever had to do one the other way, when I say it's a nightmare, you can't even compare it. So the problem is when you're here doing it, you don't realize that there was another way. And we had never done it that way. So we automatically think, oh, this is how you do this. And it's almost like I compare our techniques to watching a infomercial where you're like, oh, I didn't realize how hard it was to stir the own pot when I could put a robot stirrer in there that just moves around by itself. So, it's always like when you see an infomercial, it's always about, well, here's the problem that took so long, and here's the new way to do it. And you see something like this, Anita's Wonderland. This quilt has so many techniques that even if you had quilted for years, you would not be able to make this. So any of our people that load or open an Anita file and follow this simple tutorial can make this successfully every single time without measuring, without learning advanced techniques. So it really is as simple as take your fabric, put it down in the hoop, choose your colors, hit start. And you will wind up with a perfect quilt block every time. Now, what you can't do is, still doesn't finish it by itself. So you still have to stitch the blocks together, and you still have to bind the quilt, but you don't have to quilt it. That was one of the hardest parts, obviously, is the stippling, it's that kind of stuff, but the possibilities are kind of endless.